or sets of circumstances which could possibly affect the achievement of the project. By working with that as risk management. This is a very important topic for any project, and one, as a project manager myself, I get very excited about. So risk management is the definition of risk management. It's a process that allows individual risk events and overall risk to be understood and managed proactively. That, I think, is the most important word here. Optimizing success by minimizing threats and maximizing opportunities. We'll send these slides out, so you need to write them all down. Now, the good news about risk management, I'm a risk manager. I do a lot of risk management, I'm a risk manager, but also, you're all risk managers as well, but you probably don't know it. Risk management is something we all do every day in our lives, but we don't often think about it, we just do it naturally, it's something we all do. So what do I mean by that? Let's think of an example. Everyday situation, how we manage risk without even thinking about it. We're all risk managers. Let's think of an example here. A project like this has a defined start, has a defined objective, and a defined finish. We're going to start here today, and we want to be somewhere else. In this case, we have a deadline. We want to be somewhere in the future with a cost parameter, a time parameter, and resource use, etc. That's basically what a project is. It will change the world in some way. Something down to a more fundamental level. To say that a car journey could be seen as a project. So I say we're all risk managers. Say we're going to drive from here to Nairobi. We're going to somehow change the world. We have a defined start when we leave here. We have a defined finish when we get to Nairobi. We know it's going to take us approximately 1.5 hours. So we know what the time constraint is. We know how much it's going to cost us in terms of fuel. If we have our own car, or if we hire a taxi or whatever, we know how much that's going to cost us. So a car journey, it's a bit like a project. We have a defined start, we have a defined goal, and the parameters to go from A to B. We know how much it's going to take, how much it's going to cost. So using that definition, an uncertain event or set of circumstances should it occur have an effect on the achievement. So we start thinking, okay, if I want to make that journey, I know it's going to take 90 minutes. Say I want to get to Nairobi for 12 o'clock. So I leave here, 10:30? But you think, risk. What are the risks that could happen? I could get a flat tire. I could run out of fuel. I could get lost. I could very much get lost. I could break down. These are all risks that can occur on that journey, which could delay. These are events or circumstances. Should they occur, will have an effect on my outcome. So that will delay potentially my 90-minute journey to Nairobi. And potentially, if I need a tow truck, it could get very expensive. So knowing how much it will cost me, suddenly could take much longer and cost me a lot more. So what do? We plan ahead. As we're all risk managers, we subconsciously make decisions here. We check the air of the tyres so that we try and avoid the puncture. Make sure we've got tyres which are fit for purpose. So we proactively do something to avoid that. We check the fuel in the car as a way of making sure that we've got enough fuel for that journey. That's a risk mitigation. We bring a map, a GPS, to make sure we know where we're going. We get the car serviced or checked to make sure that it's actually roadworthy, so it actually makes it to the destination. So what we're doing there, in that little example, we're identifying risks. We all do that subconsciously. We think there's a risk. Might run out of fuel. Don't want to do that. And then we plan accordingly. So that's a good example of what a project in its most fundamental sense is. This is what that's why we're all risk managers here. So risk is something which could derail that journey in some way. This project here is going to have hundreds, thousands of risks over the course at different levels. We'll talk about that in a minute. But a risk is something that could derail that successful outcome of the project. We also have something called an issue. It's good to have a definition here. What's a risk versus an issue? In this picture here, I'm walking along. There's a risk I could fall in that hole. That's a risk. It could happen. So naturally, I take mitigation action. I step around it or whatever. An issue is I've fallen in that hole. An issue is a risk that's taken place right now. So if I'm walking along, there's a hole, there's a risk I might fall in and go around it. That's a risk. My plan, I've been a risk manager and I've taken mitigation action. I've fallen in that hole, it's an issue. Simple definition, it's good to understand that because any project is going to have many, many issues that need to be resolved in some way. And an issue is also going to derail a project, but it's something that's happening now, so it needs to be resolved before you can move forward. So it's good to make that distinction between a risk and issue. Risk is a continual cycle activity. Beginning of every project, I always do a risk training, risk management, risk identification workshop, which is what we're going to do here in a few minutes. The reason for doing that is that risk is a live thing. Risk never goes away until the project is finished. So at the beginning of the project, you always identify risk, and we're going to identify some risks soon. You then go through this process of assessing that risk, or prioritising the risk, which are the high risks, which are the low risks, which are the risks that can happen now, which are the risks that can happen later, what's the impact of those risks. You then provide mitigation action here also, in terms of, right, I understand here's a risk, this could happen, this could stop me from driving to Nairobi safely, so you do something, you plan a mitigation action proactively. You then monitor that risk. So as you're driving your car, just check the fuel gauge, make sure you're not leaking fuel, so you're monitoring that risk. And then you go around the circle again, you identify the risks, some risks will then close, new risks will open up. You constantly go around this loop here. Risk is not a linear process, it's a constant loop. Risk will only be complete when the project's finished and everything's done and everybody's happy, hopefully. Then risk closes. So it's a continuous process. In any project, especially like this one, I'm always keen that we set up very regular risk assessment workshops. So we talk about risk every month or so. We come and revisit it and say, okay, on this risk inventory, this risk register, are these risks still live? Are they still here? Have they closed? Has the impact of this risk changed? And if that risk is closed, then park it as a closed risk. And then we find new risks, because as projects go through processes, there's always risks. Planning is a risk, I spoke about that. Finance is a risk. So many risks. So it's a constant process. You can't just do it at the beginning and forget about it. In order to proactively manage risk, you have to keep looking at it, update the risk register, keep thinking about it. Very, very, very important. And again, a number of people, the number of projects I've worked with over the years, and people say, okay, we'll look at risk at the beginning, and they're just, yeah, we don't want to look at the risk register again. Wrong. Risk is important. It'll come and bite you if you're not careful. So taking that circular risk process, you put it into a flowchart, process flowchart here. This is how risk works in any project. You have a risk identification workshop. You have a risk registration process where you capture the risks in a document. I'll show you an example in a minute. I like to use Excel, a very clean, simple way of looking at a document. You undertake a risk analysis. What does that risk mean? Undertake a qualitative and or quantitative analysis of that risk. In other words, you can look and say, okay, here's a risk. What does that mean in terms of financial implication or time implication if that risk were to happen? So you can use a quantitative assessment. We actually put a value to it. And say delay for whatever reason could cost us this many million shillings, or it could cost us this much time. Or you might take a qualitative assessment where you just make an assessment that this will cause a problem. From the assessment, teach back around to risk registration again, because you're always going to find new risks on that. And having done that, you then go into response planning. So you come up with your mitigation actions. What is it we're going to do to mitigate this risk, to minimize this risk taking place? And then risk monitor and control, and that goes back around the system again, constantly. And of course, there's always going to be a reporting procedure here. And the bigger the project, of course, and there's more stakeholders, senior, etc. The more you need to keep people informed at different reporting levels, high level, lower level, what's happening in terms of risk. So that's the process as a flowchart. And that is what we do to manage risk, think about risk. Mentioned in terms of different types of risk, it's worth knowing that any project, especially a project of this size, is going to have a number of different levels of risk assessment. At the very top end, there's always going to be the strategic level risk in terms of what are the very high level risks. And we'll talk about some of those today, hopefully. And of course, as you go through drilling down into the detail of the programs, you get different level risk registers and right down to individual project risk registers, which of course people like the contractors will take on as well. So they'll have their own risk registers. So any project of a certain size will always have a number of different level risk registers based on who is monitoring that project, who's the owner of that risk register, and who's trying to proactively manage that project. So it's worth mentioning that. At the moment, we're looking very much here at the strategic level. Good so far? Risk appetite. This is an interesting subject. Everybody here, as you're all risk managers as well, has a different appetite to risk. And risk appetite, you can say, it's a little bit like a thermostat here, where you can turn it high, you can turn it low. Again, we all do this. We all have our risk appetite. We all have our approach and our view on risks. People driving, for example. You see people driving extremely fast. You know that their risk appetite is set one way, so they're going to take that risk and drive fast. And some people might drive very slowly. I don't want to crash or anything to happen, so they're set the other way. And that's exactly the same on any project. Every stakeholder, every organisation, the KLC, the city, architects, contractors, everybody has an appetite for risk that can be set one way or another. It's always good to understand how people's risk thermostat is set. Different examples here. People can be risk averse. They try and avoid risk at all costs. So they'll try and do the safest approach they can possibly take with risk, and they will use contractual means to pass the risk, or they'll avoid doing things that means they don't want to take risks. Some people risk seeking. I'm not sure why you want to do that. I guess investors sometimes like risk seek. They like to go for the high risk investments because they'll know they make a good return on it. Or risk neutral. The risk is neither actively sought nor avoided. So again, it depends. It's good to understand how people's thermostats are set. And that's something, again, for yourselves, as you're thinking about the project, from your individual organisations, how is your risk thermostat set? Okay, so once we identify the risk and we've thought about, as an organisation, how the risk is going to be looked at, we do this qualitative and quantitative analysis. What's this risk going to cost us in terms of money? What's this risk going to cost us in terms of time? I mean, Brian, you were talking earlier about the importance that time kills projects. So time here clearly is a huge risk. So when you think about that, if something happens, how long is that going to delay us? Could it delay us a month, 2 months, 3 months? If that risk then coupled with another risk, could that month, 2 month delay suddenly become a year? We don't know. That's why it's good to understand these risks and proactively monitor them. And then we think about the priority of risks. What becomes an important risk to this project? And then we do a very simple assessment here, it's the risk index, which is the probability of a risk occurring times the impact of what will happen if that risk occurs. And that gives us the rating, high or low, or percentage or whatever, but that gives us an idea. I'll give you perhaps a silly example, a good example. Probability of risk occurring versus impact. What's the probability right now of a meteorite hitting us? Very, very low, almost zero. But what's the impact if we were to get hit by a meteorite right now? Pretty high. I think we'd be pretty much squashed. So that's a low probability, high impact. Doing the risk index, the answer will be it's considered a low risk. Some things could be high risk and high impact, in which case they become high on the risk index, which means that they become priority risk. They become the high risks. So the risks are a high probability of happening, and a high impact if it happens, and that impact can be on cost, on time, on quality, on reputation, on anything. Then that could be considered a high risk, and that needs to be flagged according to high risk. And high risks need to be managed proactively. Every risk needs to be managed proactively, but high risks are always important. Does that make sense? Good, good. And then we think about mitigation action. So we've identified the risk, we've identified the probability of that risk happening, and the impact if it happens. We've also identified then the overall risk, priority level. Then we think about the mitigation action. How are we going to deal with that risk? How do we work with it? How do we proactively make sure that we minimise the impact of that risk on this project? There's a number of recognised techniques here. There's avoidance. You avoid that risk somehow. So you either eliminate that risk in some way, you withdraw from some type of process, or you don't be involved in it at all. If I want to avoid having a car accident today, I might not get in the car and drive. That's a risk avoidance. Another one is to reduce the risk in some way, do something to reduce that risk. I might decide that I might let someone else drive today for me. So from my personal perspective, it reduces my risk of having an accident in the car, for example. This project says, well, in many ways, how to reduce risk. Sharing. Find some way of sharing that risk with somebody else. You can insure certain risks. You can also, through contractual means, you can often basically pass the risk out to somebody else. People, for example, undertake design-build projects, where basically a contractor is given an entire project to build, manage and operate. We're actually sharing that risk with them, by transferring that risk to them, so they're taking the risk. Or you can retain the risk. You can accept that that risk might happen, in which case you have to plan for it at the time. Or you could say, okay, this risk could happen, but we're actually going to put budgets, increase budgets to cover that risk taking place. You add value, add money to the project to have a risk fund. So 4 ways of controlling risk there, or you can manage and mitigate risk. And then this, you can't read, but that's good. You're not supposed to read this. This is a risk register from a project I did in China a couple of years ago. And this was the full, it goes on for another couple of pages, but just to give you an idea of how a risk register can look. These should actually be read here. These were high priority risks, so that they're red for blood. This system I use is a fairly simple system, and I'm glad Yoel was talking about keep it simple, stupid earlier, because for me, one of the most important things about managing risk is keeping it simple. I've worked with many organisations, and I say, can I see your risk register? They give you this most complicated Excel document with 25 tabs, all with formulas and doing things. I'm saying, well, okay, when was the last time this was updated? And like, we don't really work with it because it's a bit complicated. And that, what is a problem? Risk needs to be kept fairly simple in terms of getting people to engage. The more, from my experience, the more complicated you make risk assessment, the less people look at it. The more people sort of switch off and don't want to engage. So keep it simple, in my mind, is the perfect way to do it. So this risk register here, it's got the basic information. So we've got the risk items here. These are the risks, and these are put under categories here. So we have category A, category B, and all those risks lumped together. The probability of that risk taking place is shown in this column here. For this spreadsheet here, we put as a simple 1 to 5. 1 as a low probability, 5 as a high probability. Again, trying to keep it simple. Then we had the impact on cost, the impact on time, the impact on quality here. Again, a 1 to 5 rating, and that gave us an overall risk assessment here. Again, this is red, blood, meaning high risk, yellow is medium, green is low risk. And then risk owners, the mitigation action, and finally the action owner. So that's how it should look in terms of a completed risk register. And in a minute we'll have a look at a live example Okay, so what I'm going to do now is, I've spoken enough about risk. What I'm going to do is actually take 5 minutes or so. We're actually going to ask